NHL insider Pierre LeBrun has released a very long and detailed article outlining where he feels all NHL teams are at heading into the NHL trade deadline and what their plans might be. We're going to take a look at some of the key points of the article, focusing on the Boston Bruins, Montreal Canadiens, Toronto Maple Leafs, Ottawa Senators, Florida Panthers, and others. We'll jump into all that coming up next. Welcome back to another video here at Top Shelf Hockey. Now, as I mentioned, NHL insider Pierre LeBrun, who writes for The Athletic and also works for TSN, has a very detailed and interesting article giving his thoughts and inside knowledge on all 31 NHL teams and where he feels they're at ahead of the NHL trade deadline and what their plans likely are. Now, to go through the entire article would take way too long, so I'm not going to cover that in just one video. We'll probably take some different tidbits of this article here, perhaps over the next few days as things develop, and we can discuss some of these things over the All-Star break. Now, of course, I want to kick things off with the New York Rangers. Now, we did get some news today from this article, and it's been reported elsewhere as well, that Chris Kreider, who's probably the top guy on the trade bait board, who likely will be dealt ahead of the NHL trade deadline, is not talking contract extensions with the New York Rangers. That's been confirmed by his agent that they have not been holding contract extension talks. So the fact that we're 1 month out from the deadline, and with the Rangers' history of selling off pending unrestricted free agents over the last few years, the fact that they're very likely not going to be a playoff team here yet again this year leads me to think that he's definitely going to be moved. It's just a matter of where and what's the return going to be. Now, if you go through all the different teams in this article, with LeBrun speculating what their plans are, there's definitely 3 or 4 teams that appear to be the most likely frontrunners to land Chris Kreider, that appear to be showing the most interest, and of course, it makes the most sense from what their team needs heading into the playoffs. Of course, one of the leading contenders is the Boston Bruins, who we've discussed before. Of course, Kreider's from that area. He would fit in well with the Bruins and how his style of play is. I do think they'd probably prefer somebody for that right side over the left side, but either way, I think they could make it work, and Kreider, very well, like I said, could fit in well there longer term as well. I mean, obviously, these guys are not necessarily just rental players. Of course, some of these guys might be acquired as rental players, but if things work out, they very well could end up staying and, inking a new contract sometime here in the near future as well. Other teams mentioned here in the Chris Kreider sweepstakes as well include the defending Stanley Cup champions St. Louis Blues. Now, of course, one thing that's a little bit tricky with the Blues is it's not 100% confirmed that Vladimir Tarasenko won't be back before the end of the season. So that's obviously going to make an impact on their cap situation. Obviously, right now, they can place him a long-term injury reserve to get the relief to make other additions to the roster, but if they need to have that space back to activate him before the end of the regular season, that could certainly cause a problem. But by the time we reach the deadline, they should have a better indication of where things are at with Tarasenko. I know there were some reports indicating before that they were optimistic and hopeful that he could return maybe sometime in late March to get some games under his belt before the playoffs. A chance to kind of shake off the rust and get back into the swing of things here before the playoffs get started. So whether or not he's able to return before the playoffs will make an impact. But the Blues clearly do have interest to add another scoring top 6 winger if they're able to do so, depending on his recovery. Now, another team mentioned as well, as we've discussed before, is the Colorado Avalanche. Now, the Avalanche are a team certainly looking to make some acquisitions ahead of the deadline. They're a team on the rise. They're a team with a lot of assets when it comes to young prospects and picks that could be used as trade bait in order to make them better right now. Of course, like I said, they also made a big trade this past summer, acquiring Nazem Kadri from Toronto for Tyson Barrie. That certainly added another dimension to their center depth. Obviously adds another dimension to their physicality. Adding Chris Kreider to that mix as well. If they could put them two together on a line, that could certainly create a lot of chaos for a lot of teams battling them in the playoffs. And if they want to go on a long playoff run, they're going to need some players that can play that style of hockey, and he would certainly fit the bill and could fit in there quite nicely. And as I've reported in other videos recently, the Avalanche and the Rangers have been scouting each other quite closely, so it would not be a huge shock to see the Avalanche make a pitch to land the services of Chris Kreider. Now, he goes on to talk as well about the Montreal Canadiens, and he goes on to say here that he feels that the Habs could very well go into selling mode sooner than later, and that some of their pending UFAs he feels they could sell off, likely regardless of where things are at, closer to the deadline, and that includes guys like Ilya Kovalchuk, Nate Thompson, as well as defenseman Marco Scandella that they acquired recently from the Buffalo Sabres. He feels they could likely flip all 3 of those players regardless of if they're in a position to make the playoffs or not. Obviously, they could get some other assets back that he doesn't feel feel they're likely going to be retaining him longer term. I know there's some fans out there who feel Kovalchuk's been such a good fit and he's played so well on a cheap contract that if they could re-sign him for another year or more at a fairly low rate, given the past history, that maybe it'd be worth it and might actually work out longer term. And it is, I guess, a distinct possibility. But LeBrun feels that the Habs could go into selling mode in those cases, even without knowing their playoff fate. But he does feel, obviously, that they're going to have quite a monumentous challenge to get into the playoffs. Therefore, the fact that he could likely become sellers is quite high in his opinion. Now, he also goes on to talk about a couple other key players that are not pending unrestricted free agents that have one more year left in their deal outside of this season. That's defenseman Jeff Petrie and as well as forward Thomas Tatar. Now, both those players are not a given to be moved, that there is some talk that the Habs could be receiving calls from other teams that are interested in their services. It's not just pending UFAs lately that seem to be attractive to other teams. A lot of guys with 1 year left on their contract for reasonable value has certainly also gained a lot of interest and become very interesting at the NHL trade deadline here in recent years as well. So Montreal might not intend to move those players, but they certainly could be fielding calls, getting some interest. And if a right offer comes along, it possibly could happen. And when it comes to Petrie, one team he mentioned that he felt could be of interest would be the Vegas Golden Knights. Vegas is clearly a team that needs a puck-moving defenseman, and Petrie could fit in quite nicely with what they need over there. Of course, the Habs in Vegas have done a deal recently before involving Tatar and Pacioretty, which happened not that long ago. So there is some trade history there as well. So I guess we will see on Petrie, but not a given that he gets moved, but there certainly could be some interest. Same goes for Thomas Tatar. It doesn't mean that they're going to trade him. He's played very, very well for Montreal since he was acquired. I mean, that deal looks like it very well could work out quite nicely. The return for Pacioretty might have seemed a little bit underwhelming perhaps to some at the beginning when the trade first took place, but Tatar's fit in and played extremely well for Montreal. Wouldn't be shocking if they did try to extend him, but one team that could come calling that very well would have an interest could be the Edmonton Oilers. Of course, Thomas Tatar would be extremely familiar to his former GM, Ken Holland, who drafted him and had him a long time in the Detroit Red Wings organization. The Edmonton Oilers clearly do need some help on the wings going into the playoffs, some scoring depth, so he would be an excellent fit there. Not quite sure what the return package would have to be to satisfy Montreal or what the Oilers could offer. Maybe they go down the road to offering up Jesse Puljujarvi and along with something else. I don't think Puljujarvi would be enough to pull the deal off, but even though he can't play this year, could be another great asset for Montreal moving forward. Just a possibility. There's obviously no direct link that they're having talks, but certainly some deals there that he felt could possibly make sense. And of course, you get the Florida Panthers, who are suddenly in the playoff mix here as well after a bit of a slow start, and they're the league's highest scoring team at the All-Star breaks. So they clearly don't need to really add anything in the way of offense. One thing that would be good for them to do would be to get some hopefully better goaltending from Sergei Bobrovsky in the second half here down the stretch, but also the blue line. They would certainly like to add some more defensive help, somebody who could play more of a defensive role, perhaps somebody like a shutdown type of defenseman. And one name he mentions in the article here is Sharks defenseman Brendan Dillon, who does appear to be very, very likely to be moved as a pending unrestricted defenseman here at the deadline as well. The Sharks are clearly falling out of the contention for the playoffs. Very high probability that they become a seller, and Dillon is one of the top targets to be moved. I do think there'd be a fair bit of other teams interested in his service as well, but certainly a team like the Florida Panthers do make a lot of sense for that type of player. I mean, really offensively, they don't need to add anything to their forward group. They don't really need an offensive type of defenseman. A lot of those players that they already have are doing the job extremely well. Ideally, though, like I said, some better goaltending would help, but they're not going to be making any trades there with the big-time contract of Bobrovsky on their salary cap situation. That's not going to be changing anytime soon, but a defensive defenseman to kind of help keep the puck down the other end and to shut down some of the other league's top players more often would certainly be preferable to help the Panthers move forward. He also goes on to talk a lot about the Ottawa Senators, and the Senators could be a team that sell off quite a few assets. Really, they have a lot of expiring contracts, a lot of pending UFAs, with the biggest name of all being Jean-Gabriel Pageau. But he does mention in this article that he feels there's a pretty good possibility that the Senators and Pageau could very well work out a contract extension, and he very well might end up staying. As I mentioned before, I do think it's a possibility as well. He's certainly a great role model, works hard, he's a leader on the team. They do need some veterans to stick around and help move the rebuild forward. He's from the area, has played his whole career there, and I really do think there's a decent chance he stays. Not a given by any means. We've seen a mass exodus of UFAs leave Ottawa in last couple of years here. Wouldn't be shocking if he was moved, but at the same time, I do think the odds of him staying are much higher than we've seen in the past with more of their other higher profile players who have been traded over the last couple of years. But there's certainly a long list of other UFAs that it would not be surprising if they were traded as rental players, and that includes a big chunk of their blue line, including defenseman Ron Hainsey, Mark Borowiecki, and Dylan DeMello. Of course, in the forward group, they got guys like Vladislav Nemestikov, who they picked up very cheaply from the Rangers, who's played pretty well, but not a given that he really fits longer term. He could stick around, but he could go. It's kind of really on the fringe. I think it kind of depends on what the return could be. They've also got guys like Tyler Ennis, for example, who they signed to a one-year deal and hasn't done too badly this year, so he could be a depth piece for another team heading into the playoff mix. So the Senators very well could look quite differently next year. So here I want to touch on the Toronto Maple Leafs. Of course, the Leafs are a team that's really talked about quite a lot. Obviously, the Leafs have a huge fan base, one of the biggest markets in the NHL, so clearly they do get a lot of attention when it comes to what moves they might make, and obviously there's been a lot of talk lately about the fact that they've struggled, and they head into the All-Star break 4 points out of a playoff spot, which is well below expectations. We have already seen them fire coach Mike Babcock this year, replace him with Sheldon Keefe. Keefe took over. They certainly had a nice prolonged stretch of better play, but unfortunately, they're no further ahead than they were when Babcock left. And the big talk around the Leafs is whether or not they would be able to acquire a top four defenseman to really solidify that blue line, because they clearly have enough offensive weapons up front to keep the puck down the other end and score lots of goals. That's certainly not a problem for the Leafs. And there's some people critiquing goaltender Freddie Anderson lately as well, of whether or not he's good enough to get them over the hump in the playoffs. And I guess only time will tell. I don't really see anything happening with him, but there could be some moves on the backup situation, as Michael Hutchinson hasn't been the greatest in that role throughout the season. The main storyline LeBrun focuses on in this article is the fact that guys like Kasperi Kapanen wouldn't be traded unless it involves a larger deal with something that's going to make the team significantly better, as we've discussed here on a couple of occasions before. Some of the defensemen he names as potential guys that they could be going after are players that we have looked at as well, including Matt Dumba, the Minnesota Wild, as well as Josh Manson of the Anaheim Ducks. And he also mentions the possibility of the Leafs revisiting the trade with the Calgary Flames that almost happened this past summer. Of course, that trade almost sent Nazem Kadri to the Flames, which was rejected by him, and instead they ended up doing that deal with Colorado, which brought them Tyson Barrie, but it was believed they were targeting defenseman TJ Brody. And from what we know, it sounds like players like Kadri and I think Connor Brown, before he was traded to Ottawa, were heading over to the Flames. So clearly there was a deal that was going to be made there. They had interest in Brody. Could they possibly revisit that? Maybe take a deal like a TJ Brody, maybe a Sam Bennett, something like that for one of their younger forwards like Kasperi Kapanen. I'm not sure if that's exactly what it would take to get it done, but clearly the Flames do have some other interesting young players as well, and the Leafs and the Flames very well could revisit talks they had on the offseason to see if they can find a deal there. Clearly the Flames had some interest in some of their younger forwards, and they very well could spark more talks if they have what each other needs heading into the deadline. So that is your latest rumor roundup here for today. Of course, as always, we'll know your thoughts and opinions and everything discussed. Let me know what trades you think we're going to see ahead of the deadline down in the comments, and we can discuss further. If you're new to the channel, consider subscribing, turning on your notifications so you don't miss any future content, and give this video a thumbs up if you enjoyed it as well. I'd appreciate it if you did. As always, thank you for watching, and I will catch you next time.